Forget everything you thought you knew about power, about the divine right to rule, about invincible armies. Today we dissect a story that will make you question the very nature of global dominance. Imagine Achaemenid Persia, the greatest ancient empire, suddenly finds itself under the sway not of a royal descendant nor a military commander, but a simple priest, a magus, a man with no army, no noble lineage, not a single ally. And this man, Gaumata, didn't just temporarily seize the palace. He ruled this colossal empire for 7 months, impersonating the murdered Prince Bardiya. 7 months. This is no mistake. No legend. This is arguably the most audacious, brazen, seemingly impossible con in human history. How could one man, even if strikingly similar to the deceased heir, deceive not only the court but entire nations? What monstrous turn of events, what incredible blindness, or even conscious complicity of the elite made this possible? We're not talking about petty fraud, but the capture of the very heart of a world power, achieved not by sword, but by lies, by a meticulously planned mystification. This is a true political and psychological thriller, where the fate of millions hung in the balance. But to understand how such madness was even conceivable, we must delve into the darkest corners of the royal court and the soul of a tyrant whose decisions paved the way for this deception. We've already mentioned Gaumata, this phantom who sat on the throne of the greatest empire for 7 months. But how was this possible? How did a man with no army, no lineage, no visible support manage to pull off a scam that even today would be called insanity? The answer lies not only in his audacity, but also in the rotting, paranoid swamp that Persia had become under the rule of one of history's most deranged kings. This isn't just a story of deception. It's an anatomy of a society pushed to its limits and an analysis of the psychology of power that, reaching a boiling point, ultimately spawns its own gravediggers. Imagine Persia at that time, not the majestic empire we usually picture, but a kingdom gripped by fever. On the throne sat Cambyses II, a figure whose shadow fell over every corner of the realm, growing darker by the day. His reign began with brilliant conquest, but soon spiraled into an abyss of madness, cruelty, and paranoia. The Egyptian campaign, which seemed a triumph, became for the king not only a military success, but also a fatal descent into the depths of his own mind. Ancient chronicles, full of hints and evasions, paint a picture of a ruler obsessed with suspicion, whose power became an instrument of blind, irrational rage. He killed his close associates for the slightest offenses, mocked sacred customs, and desecrated temples. But the most terrible, most devastating blow to the empire's stability was his decision, made in a fit of manic fear, the secret murder of his own brother, Bardiya, the legitimate heir, beloved by the people, and a potential rival. This murder, committed in deep secrecy, became the crack in the foundation through which the poison of chaos seeped into the empire. No one, except a small circle of individuals, knew the truth. And it is in this impenetrable veil of lies and fear that the key to Gaumata's phenomenon lies. Somewhere in the shadows, among those who observed the decay of power, the mad dance of Cambyses on the precipice, was Gaumata, a magus, a priest, a man whose origin and position allowed him to be close enough to the court to see, hear, and understand more than common mortals. And most importantly, he had a brother, whose name history prefers to suppress, or perhaps it was erased by those who wrote it later. A brother who bore an astonishing, almost mystical resemblance to the murdered Bardiya. And then came that very moment, that point of no return. Not a random thought, but a cold, soul-chilling calculation. Gaumata and his brother, observing Cambyses' madness, his desperate attempt to conceal Bardiya's murder, suddenly realized something fundamental. Power, which seemed unshakable, was in fact incredibly vulnerable. It rested on myth, on fear, on lies. And if those lies could be created, they could also be exploited. The mirror image of the murdered prince, knowledge of his death, the pervasive atmosphere of paranoia and secrecy, all of this combined into a diabolical formula. This was not just an idea. It was an epiphany. A terrifying, yet incredibly alluring realization that one could not just deceive, but become the one who was awaited, the one who would restore hope. Meanwhile, society was suffocating. People were exhausted by Cambyses' tyranny, his unpredictable rage, constant executions, and heavy taxes required for endless military campaigns. Tensions in Persia were nearing a breaking point. The people, tired of despotism, yearned for change. They wanted stability, justice, a return to those golden times when the king was a father, not an executioner. Any spark could ignite a fire. Any news of salvation, even the most incredible, could be embraced with open arms. This thirst for change, this readiness to believe in a miracle, this weariness of a madman's rule, this is what created the ideal, fertile ground for the imposter. Gaumata didn't just deceive. He gave people what they desperately wanted, the hope of the legitimate heir's return, who they believed would end the nightmare. And how masterfully he would play on this hope, how virtuously he would manipulate their aspirations, turning his scheme into something more than just a deception. But we will discuss that when we delve into the details of his ascent to the throne. And so, while the mad Cambyses, intoxicated by his power and probably something stronger, was bogged down in the sands of Egypt, committing his bloody excesses there, in the heart of the Achaemenid Empire, in distant media, the most audacious theatrical performance in history was unfolding. Not just a rebellion, not a mundane coup. This was something far more subtle, elegant, and by God brilliant in its unscrupulousness. Behind the scenes of this grand deception stood Gaumata, a priest, a magus, or, as we would say today, a master of manipulation and psychological pressure. He didn't just declare himself king. No, he declared himself Bardiya, the very prince whom Cambyses, by his own order, had long since sent to the grave. Remember how we spoke of the widespread thirst for change, of the hatred for the tyrant? Gaumata was not merely a fraud. He was a catalyst who used this thirst, this hatred, turning them into fuel for his ascent. The plan was simple, like all brilliant ideas, and therefore almost flawless. We don't know all the details, but imagine this scene. One fine day, around March 522 BCE, news spread throughout the Persian Empire like a virus. Not just news, but a decree. In the name of Bardiya, son of Cyrus, the legitimate heir to the throne. I, Bardiya, have returned. I am alive, and I am your new king. It was a thunderclap in a clear sky, a blow meant to stun Cambyses and paralyze his court, and it worked. Cambyses himself learned of it in Syria, halfway back from Egypt. Rumors reached him, and then official confirmation. Bardiya, your brother, has seized your throne. What was his state? Fury? Horror? Or the chilling realization that his carefully guarded secret, the murder of his own brother, had become a weapon in the hands of an imposter? He, Cambyses, had created this loophole, this power vacuum that Gaumata so masterfully filled. He had dug his own grave when he killed Bardiya, and now that grave had opened to swallow him. Cambyses, blinded by rage, rushed back to Persia. He gathered troops, prepared for war, for a bloody reckoning with whoever dared to challenge him. But fate, or, as conspiracy theorists like to say, some invisible hand, had other plans. A sudden, mysterious death. Herodotus, our chief gossip and historian, claims that Cambyses accidentally wounded himself with his sword while mounting his horse and died of gangrene. A beautiful story, isn't it? Too beautiful. Too convenient for Gaumata. Let me ask, in an era when poisonings were commonplace and accidents were a favorite tool of political intrigue, could a powerful and furious king, who had just learned of the most massive betrayal of his life, simply by a ridiculous accident, stab himself with a sword? Or was this the final decisive stroke in Gaumata's plan? The final chord in this symphony of deception? We will never know for sure. But one thing is clear. Cambyses' death cleared Gaumata's path to absolute, unhindered rule. The throne was empty. The legitimate heir had returned, and no one could stop him. And so, Gaumata, now the undisputed Bardiya, began to consolidate his power. And he did so with a devilish cunning that is still astonishing. Instead of instituting terror, like Cambyses, he showered the people with benevolence. Yes, you heard that right. This was truly the impostor's golden age. He announced a 3-year exemption from all taxes and military service. 3 years. Imagine the jubilation of the common people. His 7 months of rule became a breath of fresh air for them after Cambyses' suffocating tyranny. This move was not just populist, it was brilliant. He bought popular love and loyalty wholesale. Who would dare to rebel against a king who granted such unprecedented generosity? Who would doubt his identity when he brought such relief? Gaumata transformed himself into a folk hero, a messiah returned from oblivion to save Persia from oppression. He laid the foundation of his power not on fear, but on gratitude and the euphoria of the masses. While the nobles shrugged in bewilderment, the people worshipped their Bardiya, and this was his main defense. But the devil, as always, was in the details. And the most dangerous detail was his true identity. Gaumata, this master of disguise, had to constantly maintain the illusion. This was especially true for those who knew the real Bardiya by sight, and there were plenty of such people, especially among the Persian nobility. The most vulnerable point in his masquerade was, of course, the harem. For Bardiya had wives, and they certainly knew their husband. And here Gaumata displayed his paranoid ingenuity. He virtually isolated all of Bardiya's wives. No one was allowed to see him. No one was allowed to enter his chambers. He lived surrounded by eunuchs and servants who were either bribed or terrified to death. The women, even the royal concubines, were locked up as if in a gilded cage, deprived of the opportunity to communicate with each other, compare observations, or share suspicions. This was a real psychological prison, created to hide one single but fatal detail. For according to rumors, the real Bardiya had no ears. Or at least, there were some physical characteristics that distinguished him from the imposter. Or more likely, it was Gaumata himself who was earless, and Cambyses had cut them off for some offense, turning this defect into his Achilles' heel. What was important was not what it was, but that it was. A detail that could not be hidden forever. A detail that could shatter his entire empire of lies. Gaumata reveled in power. He enjoyed how he, a simple priest, had fooled the entire Persian Empire. The feeling of impunity grew stronger every day. He was a king, a god who granted mercy and received worship. But it was this sense of omnipotence that became his fatal mistake. He underestimated the Persian nobility, their cunning, their connections, their unwavering loyalty to the Achaemenid dynasty. He forgot that even the most brilliant masquerades eventually end. And when the mask begins to crack, not only the true face emerges from beneath it, but also those who long to expose that face. And believe me, there were many such people. Those who carefully watched this new king, noting every oddity, every whisper, every awkward movement in this meticulously constructed theater of lies. And among them were people who didn't just suspect, but knew. They knew that something far more sinister and ambitious lay hidden beneath Bardiya's mask. And they had already begun to weave their own web. We left Persia in the throes of chaos, with an imposter on the throne, cleverly playing on the strings of popular discontent. But let's not be naive. History is never so simple that one person, however incredibly audacious, could pull off such a scheme alone. Behind every great deception lies a network, a web of interests, ambitions, and, of course, those who pull the strings. Who truly stood behind Gaumata? Who was his puppeteer? And who was merely a temporary beneficiary of this grand chess game? On the surface, it was his brother, a certain Smerdis, also a magus, who was believed to bear a striking resemblance to Prince Bardiya. But this was merely a facade. In the shadows behind the scenes of this play loomed much more powerful figures, the priesthood. The Magi, a caste whose influence Cambyses had systematically undermined with his unorthodox policies and, frankly, his insane arrogance. Imagine, a king who kills the sacred. Apis bull, who disregards ancient rituals, who prefers Egyptian gods over Persian ones. For the Magi, this was not just a challenge. It was an insult, a direct assault on their power and authority. Gaumata, or whoever used him as a puppet, could have been the ideal instrument for revenge. The restoration of traditions, a return to origins, and at the same time, the return of the Magi to the top of the political pyramid. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? History is full of such restorations under plausible pretexts, and who else reaped the benefits of this deception? Of course, the people. 3 years of exemption from taxes and military service. This was not just a populist gesture. It was a brilliant move that bought Gaumata not just loyalty, but genuine, heartfelt popular love. Who would doubt a king who suddenly grants you freedom from tax burdens and military conscription? This was a masterful strike at the foundation of any discontent. While the nobility whispered about the imposter, ordinary Persians blessed their new ruler, who seemed to have come to alleviate their plight. And there were also those at Cambyses' court who had been sidelined, who harbored resentment, who dreamed of retribution. For them, Gaumata's arrival was not just a change of power, but a chance for triumph, for a return to the game, for a redistribution of spheres of influence, and of course for personal enrichment. But in this maelstrom of deception and gain, there are always those who see through the veil. The first to sense that something was amiss was Otanes. Not just any courtier, but one of the 7 most noble Persians, husband to Cambyses' sister, and importantly, a man who knew the real Bardiya intimately. His suspicions were not unfounded. He observed changes in behavior, in the entourage, in how the pseudo-Bardiya avoided meetings with those who could expose him. Otanes, the shrewd old man, could not simply accept this farce. He began his own investigation, quiet but relentless. And then his daughter, the beautiful Fatima, enters the scene. She had been one of the real Bardiya's wives, and now, after his death, found herself in the impostor's harem. A desperate situation, wouldn't you agree? Otanes, realizing that a direct question would be useless, resorted to cunning. He asked Fatima, under cover of night, to check a very specific detail. A detail that, according to rumors, distinguished the real Bardiya from Gaumata: the absence of ears. Yes, that's right. The absence of ears. Irony of fate, or a devil's mark? Fatima, risking her life, carried out her father's request, and confirmed the worst. The ears were intact. But there was another person whose fate was inextricably linked to this secret: Prexaspes. The very Prexaspes whom Cambyses had ordered to kill the real Bardiya. A key witness, living proof of Cambyses' crime, and at the same time, the guarantor of Gaumata's legitimacy. For if Prexaspes remained silent, no one could prove that Bardiya was dead. He was trapped. On the one hand, he was forced to remain silent to avoid revealing his own involvement in the prince's murder. On the other, he knew the truth, and this truth weighed on his conscience like a stone. Or perhaps Gaumata kept him on a short leash, threatening to expose his role in Bardiya's murder if he dared to speak. A tragic figure, a hostage to others' intrigues, whose conscience ultimately became the catalyst. His silence was a shield for the impostor, but his potential word, a deadly weapon. And then, into this boiling cauldron of intrigue, fear, and ambition, burst Darius, a man whose name would soon inspire awe throughout the Achaemenid Empire. Darius, a descendant of a younger branch of the Achaemenids, but with an iron will and an insatiable thirst for power. He returned to Persia from Egypt, where he had served Cambyses as a spear-bearer, and immediately found himself at the epicenter of the conspiracy. He wasn't just one of the conspirators, he was their backbone, their brain, their driving force. His motivation? Perhaps a genuine desire to restore the true dynasty, to cleanse the throne of the impostor, or perhaps simply cold, calculated pragmatism and an ambition that saw in this situation a unique opportunity. A chance to claim a place in the sun that, in his opinion, belonged to him by right of birth and, more importantly, by right of strength. He gathered around him those who could not tolerate the lie, those who saw Gaumata not as a benefactor, but as a usurper. And the countdown began. The clock was ticking. And very soon, this meticulously woven web of lies and power would begin to tear at the seams, and its creator, to fall from a dizzying height. Darkness gathered not only over the royal palace, but also over the very idea of power based on lies. When Fatima, Otanes' daughter, returned from the harem with her chilling report, the air in the secret room where the conspirators gathered became denser than steel. "He has no ears," she whispered. And those 3 words brought down the house of cards of antiquity's greatest deception. Not merely absent, but severed, concealing a dreadful secret that betrayed the impostor. A physical deformity as the stamp of deceit, the mark of a lie that Gaumata had so meticulously hidden, cloistering himself away from the world in his harem. this tiny, repulsive flaw, exposed by Achilles. Woman's courage, and a father's suspicion, became the very puncture in the seemingly perfect illusion. Otanes, Hydarnes, Interfernes, Megabyzus, Gobrias, Aspathenes. Each of them was a noble Persian. Each felt the ground slipping from beneath their ancient lineage. But among them stood out one whose will was steel and whose gaze was fire. Darius. He had just returned from Egypt, from a world where order reigned, and was confronted with the chaos spawned by the imposter. It was Darius, a descendant of a junior branch of the Achaemenids, but with ambitions and acumen worthy of an empire's founder, who understood there was no time to wait. Every day of delay only strengthened the pseudo-Bardiya's position, allowing him to take root in the minds of the people, intoxicated by tax breaks and perceived prosperity. We must act now, or this lie will become our new reality. His voice was quiet but piercing, like a blade. Some hesitated, urging caution, a gathering of greater forces, a more thorough plan. But Darius saw further. He saw how the psychology of the masses, once they believed in a myth, became its fiercest defender. He understood that every hour delayed was a lost opportunity that could turn into their own demise. He made them swear that they would not retreat, that their oath would be sealed with blood and honor, and they agreed. The decision was made. That very night. But before the conspirators' blades were stained with blood, another, no less dramatic scene unfolded. Gaumata, sensing the gathering storm, decided to stage a daring public relations stunt, using the only living witness to the real Bardiya's murder, Prexaspes. He ordered Prexaspes to ascend the highest tower in the capital and publicly refute the rumors that the ruler was an imposter and that the real Bardiya was dead. This was a desperate move, an attempt to corner a cornered beast. Thousands of eyes were fixed on it. Prexaspes. He ascended, his figure silhouetted against the setting sun, like a grim shadow of doom. The crowd held its breath, expecting the usual lie, but instead heard a voice shaking with despair, and perhaps a final glimmer of conscience. "People of Persia," his voice thundered, amplified by the tower's echo. "I, Prexaspes, by Cambyses' command, killed the true Bardiya, and he who now sits on the throne is an imposter, the Magus Gaumata." The confession, torn from the depths of his soul, pierced the crowd like lightning. It was an act of atonement, or perhaps a desperate attempt to avoid a torturous death at the hands of the conspirators, knowing that his days were numbered anyway. Without awaiting trial or execution, Prexaspes threw himself down, shattering on the stones at the base of the tower. This public, shocking act of suicide became a signal for the bloody climax to begin. Night fell on Pasargadae, the ancient capital, but for the conspirators it became a time for action. Under the cover of darkness, like shadows, they infiltrated the palace. Every step echoed in their tense ears. This was not merely a seizure of power. It was a psychological thriller on the verge of a nervous breakdown. They knew the layout of the rooms. They knew the guards. The eunuchs, the usurper's loyal servants, were the first to stand in their way. A brief, ruthless struggle in the dim corridors, where every blow was fatal, every breath a fight for survival. Blood was shed, but the path was cleared. And then they were at the doors of the private chambers. They burst in. Inside, chaos reigned, caused by screams and noise from outside. Two magi, Gaumata and his brother, scrambled in the darkness, trying to find weapons, trying to understand what was happening. This was not a battle of armies, but a deadly duel in an enclosed space, where every sound, every rustle could mean death. Darius, driven by rage and resolve, lunged forward. His blade gleamed in the dim light, piercing one of the magi. The second magus, Gaumata himself, tried to resist, but his movements were clumsy, desperate. Blades clashed one last time. Darius, with the fate of the empire now hanging by a thread, delivered the decisive blow. Gaumata collapsed. In his eyes, dimming in the throes of death, there was not so much fear as, perhaps, bewilderment. How? How did they know? He, the great imposter, who had deceived an entire nation, who had for a time become a god on earth, fell at the hand of a man who had not succumbed to his illusion. Perhaps in his last moments, he cursed that tiniest detail, that single physical flaw that had shattered his meticulously constructed empire of lies. Or perhaps he simply looked into Darius's eyes, realizing that his game was over, and that true power tolerates no fakes. Thus ended the most audacious scam of the ancient world. But Gaumata's story is not just an ancient true crime tale. It is an eternal reminder of how fragile power is, how easily masses can be deceived, and how a single, meticulously hidden truth can bring down an entire empire of illusions. And this lesson, believe me, is relevant even today, as the world drowns in torrents of disinformation and political mirages. So the imposter was dead. The empire, it seemed, was saved from a daring scheme. But what if I told you that Gaumata's death is only the beginning of the most uncomfortable, most provocative part of our story? What if the most important lesson of this ancient drama lies not in how the deceiver was exposed, but in how easily and readily he was accepted? Because Gaumata is not just a forgotten character from a history textbook. He is an archetype. He is an eternal mirror in which our own, painfully familiar reality is reflected. Consider this. How could one man, even with a phenomenal resemblance, fool an entire empire stretching from Greece to India? The answer lies in the fragility of power, in the psychology of disillusioned masses, and in the mastery of disinformation. Gaumata didn't just impersonate another. He exploited a moment of widespread discontent, fear of a tyrant, and most cynically, the hope for a better life that he himself promised. He offered the people not just a new king, but the abolition of taxes and military service, a sweet lie that overshadowed any suspicions. Is this not an echo of what we see today? Modern populists, these political imposters who appear on the scene, promising unthinkable benefits, golden mountains, and easy solutions to complex problems. They play on the same strings: weariness of elites, the desire of ordinary people to believe in miracles, the readiness to abandon critical thinking for a convenient fairy tale. Gaumata was a master of fake news, long before the internet. His reign was a 7-month experiment in total manipulation of public consciousness. The absence of ears, a physical defect that could betray him, was hidden behind palace walls, and rumors about it were drowned in floods of beneficence. Is this not a modern media strategy, where inconvenient facts are suppressed, and negativity is overshadowed by a stream of positive but false narratives? And who were these shadowy manipulators who might have stood behind Gaumata? The Magian priests, whose influence Cambyses tried to undermine? Or secret societies that have always sought power by using puppets? We may never know the full truth, but the very fact that such a brazen deception was possible makes us wonder, who truly pulls the strings in our world when we blindly believe what we are shown and told? Finally, there's the most uncomfortable question Gaumata poses to us across millennia. Why do we so often want to be deceived? Why are we ready to believe the most incredible lies if they align with our desires, if they promise us relief from difficulties, if they give us an enemy to blame for all our troubles? Fear, hope, and conformity. All these create fertile ground for imposters of any stripe. Gaumata was merely a symptom that human nature, despite all progress, remains strikingly vulnerable to manipulation. How much do we, modern, enlightened, informed people, truly differ from those ancient Persians who lived for 7 months under the rule of a phantom, succumbing to the allure of deception? And what will happen when the next, perhaps far more sophisticated version of Gaumata emerges on our horizon, armed not just with promises, but with algorithms that know all our fears and desires? The story of Gaumata is not just an account of ancient deceit. It is a warning that the greatest danger lies not in villains, but in our own willingness to believe convenient lies, in our blindness, in our pursuit of simplicity where it doesn't exist. And that even after the imposter was overthrown, the struggle for truth, for power, and for the minds of people had only